Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar entitled House in Cambridge for Landlords, Property Owners, and Realtors. If you'd like to use the CART services for closed captioning, please click on CC and then show subtitles to turn the captions on. My name is Maura Pensack, and I'm the Housing Liaison for our fair city of Cambridge. Today's webinar is part of the city's House in Cambridge Information to Open Doors campaign, which is a year-long multi-department outreach, education, and information campaign that's designed to promote and inform everyone about all things housing. Since April, we've offered monthly webinars on a variety of housing topics, and we're really very excited today to offer this webinar to you, owners, realtors, and property managers. We sincerely thank you for attending and being willing to learn more about the process of renting to a voucher holder. And we want to encourage you to contact us if you have any suggestions on other housing topics that would be helpful. Before I turn it over to our very experienced and knowledgeable presenter, Hannah Bolcom, Director of Leased Housing and the Cambridge Housing Authority, I want to introduce Crystal Rosa, who is Program Administrator for our city's Human Rights Commission and Technical Guru of the Housing Cambridge campaign, and she'll explain how to ask a question. Crystal?
Hi, thank you, Maura. So we will be introducing Hannah in just a second, but I'm going to go to the slide on how to ask questions. At the bottom of the screen, if you hover toward the center, you should see a box that says Q&A. You can type in your question in that box. Only the presenters will be able to view your questions, and the presenters will verbally respond to as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If depending on how much time we have, it could also be throughout the presentation. But only, if you want to send it anonymously, just make sure you click on the box. And let me make sure you can see how this looks like. So yeah, so just look for the Q&A box when you hover. All right, thank you.
Great, and we will turn it over to Hannah. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Maura, and thanks, Crystal, and thank you all for having me today. As Maura said, my name is Hannah Balcom. I'm the Director of the Leased Housing Program here at Cambridge Housing Authority. I'm going to try to keep my remarks brief because I'd like to leave time for questions. I know, I don't know who's on the call and if they're existing landlords, potential new landlords, people that have heard of the Section 8 program or people that are new. So I want to leave adequate time for any questions you might have. But I guess just to start, I just sort of want to give an overview of the Cambridge Housing Authority. So Cambridge Housing Authority, I run the leased housing program, the Section 8 voucher program, and some similar state, both state and federal programs. But CHA is also a rather large landlord in the city of Cambridge. So we have around 2,700 units that we own and operate and manage as a landlord within the city of Cambridge. So, some of those are larger sites, public housing sites, project-based Section 8 sites, and others might be smaller condos that are scattered throughout the city. So we're a landlord as well as a Section 8 administrator. So in addition to those 2,700 units, we also administer, I think, over 5,000 vouchers, some of which are leased in the city of Cambridge and about half which are leased outside of the city of Cambridge. So when a participant, is a participant of one of our programs, they're not necessarily always bound to use their voucher in Cambridge. So we have folks in, I think we have 1,000 households in Boston and sort of the surrounding areas. So, I think part of the purpose of this webinar is, how do we bring more landlords onto the program, specifically in Cambridge, right? Because there's a lot of landlords and folks looking for renters in Cambridge, and we have a lot of participants and applicants that would love to live in Cambridge, either continue to live in Cambridge or would like to move back to Cambridge. Maybe they previously lived here, maybe they were priced out and they'd like to come back and take advantage of the breadth of services and opportunities that we have here in Cambridge. So we want to make that opportunity available to our participants and our applicants. And that's where landlords come in. So the great thing about the Section 8 voucher program is, it allows tenants to have, or allows participants to have choice in where they want to live, who they want to rent from. And it's also a great opportunity for landlords to work with our participants. The housing authority really, doesn't try to get too involved in that process, right? As a landlord, you want to make sure that you have a good tenant and you're getting rent, usually on the first of every month. So the housing authority is sort of there to help facilitate that process. But really, as a landlord, you should treat, somebody who's a participant of CHA the same way that you would treat any other tenant that you might have or be renting to, right? So the only difference is that, the only difference is that they're going to be getting part of the rent paid for by CHA. So one of the benefits as a landlord is that, CHA provides our portion of the rent to you, the landlord, on the first of every month. The tenant's going to pay a portion of their income towards their rent, a portion that's affordable to them based on their income. And the remainder of that monthly amount is going to come from the CHA. And so as we've seen, over the past few years, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, is that, incomes have not been steady. So if you have a tenant and they lost their job, it can be really difficult, obviously, for them to keep up with their rent payments every month, and then difficult for you as a landlord, because obviously you need the rental income coming in to be able to pay your mortgage or whatever other expenses you might have. So the benefit of somebody who participates in one of CHA's programs is that their rent's always going to be based off of their income. So if somebody's working full time, we look at their annual income. We base their rent off of typically around 30% of their income. If they start working part-time or if they lose their job, their rent gets adjusted according to their income. So as a landlord, you can be assured that, if your tenant loses their job, their rent's going to be adjusted and you will still be receiving the same amount every month. It's just the amount you receive from the housing authority will be higher and the tenant's portion will be lower. So that's sort of one of the major benefits to renting to somebody who participates in a CHA program. In terms of, I guess, the process, so how do you get connected with a CHA tenant? There's a number of ways. One of the things that, one of the main ways is that on our website, we have apartment listings. So if you're a landlord and you have a vacant unit or anticipated vacancy, you can post that unit on our website, on our apartment listings, which get updated every week. If you go to our website, there's a section for landlords and information on how to submit any vacant units that you have. We pass out those apartment listings to any of our participants who are out searching, and they'll use those and they'll contact you directly. Say, I see you have a 3-bedroom in Central Square, and they would go through the normal process of how you would normally screen a tenant, for occupancy of your unit. So again, just to reiterate, you should treat somebody who has a CHA voucher as a CHA participant the same way you would treat, any other person or household that was applying for one of your units. If you typically, do housing history and reach out to prior landlords, you should definitely do that. You want to still make sure that you're, going to get a tenant that's going to be a good fit for your unit and be able to, pay the rent every month. So in terms of the paperwork, so, once you've identified a tenant, they will provide you with paperwork that CHA would need. So obviously, in order for us to pay you, the landlord, we would need to know, which bank account you'd like us to deposit the money in every month. So there's some paperwork related to that. We also have to make sure that you are the owner of the unit, or if there's a management company involved, who the management company is, and who we should be paying. And then there's an inspection of the unit. So, typically that happens within a few days of receiving all of the paperwork. We have an inspection company that goes out, does a quick walkthrough of the unit, make sure that everything is up to code. Typically, if it's, you know, in line with the state sanitary code, then it will pass our inspection as well. And again, that usually happens within a few days. Once the inspection passes, we let both parties know you're good to execute the lease. You would execute a lease with the tenant the way you normally would. And then CHA would generate an agreement between the landlord and CHA. And that is just, you know, the agreement that we are going to pay you on the first of every month. And then there would be a letter that outlines the amount that CHA is going to pay and the amount that the tenant's going to pay. So that's sort of the process in a nutshell, right? So, you know, you can post your units with CHA, identify a tenant, complete the paperwork. An inspection will happen shortly thereafter, execute the lease, and then you'll get a letter from CHA showing the breakdown of the payments. And then from there, I mean, you know, the tenant has to recertify with the CHA, usually every 2 years or so, sometimes every year, sometimes every 2 years. That process is between CHA and the participant. At that point, their rent might change a little bit, in which case you would be notified. If the tenant portion went up $100 and CHA's portion went down, you would be notified as the landlord if there was any changes. But generally, you know, throughout the year, you know, we don't see too many changes, especially if the household is on a fixed income. So that's sort of, I guess, the process from identifying a tenant to lease up. I mentioned sort of the advantages of renting to a CHA voucher holder, affordability, the ability of the landlord to know that you're going to get payments from CHA on the first of every month. And also, you know, not that this happens a lot, but if there's any issues that come up, you know, CHA, you know, we're not a judge, we're not a court of law, we can't evict a tenant, anything like that, but we can be helpful if you are having an issue and you want something to be communicated to a tenant, you know, just kind of having an extra set of eyes there, you know, to help you communicate with the tenant, or we can reach out to an emergency contact if you're having trouble reaching, things like that. So like I said, so the Cambridge Housing Authority, not only are we a landlord ourselves, but we also, I think we have about 1,200 different landlords that we work with, both in Cambridge and outside the city of Cambridge. So we understand being a landlord, we understand working with landlords, and you know, are always looking to bring new landlords onto our program. One thing I just want to make sure I mention, we do have some incentives, incentive programs. So, you know, we know that upfront costs can often be a barrier for low-income people to accessing or moving to a new unit, right? If you need first month, last month security deposit and a realtor's fee, that could be very difficult for a low-income household to come up with. But we understand that as a landlord, you want to have assurances, security deposit, first month's rent, things like that. So what CHA, we do have some incentive programs whereby as the landlord, if you're willing to waive the security deposit or accept a reduced security deposit, then CHA will provide damage payments if the tenant vacates without or leaving damage to the unit. We very rarely see tenants vacate with damage to the unit, but we know that as a landlord, you would want that assurance that if something like that did happen, CHA would be able to provide the funds needed to make those repairs. So we have some incentives like that, you know, just to help sort of ease some of those upfront costs that can be difficult for clients to come up with. There's also, the city has other resources. The other benefit is CHA is aware of a lot of the other resources that we can connect tenants to throughout the city. So the multi-service center, there are some state funds. There's a lot of state and local funds out there right now to not just help tenants, but also to landlords. And we can help connect our participants and our landlords to those resources if we know about them. So I'm going to stop there. Unless, Maura, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. But if not, then I'm happy to sort of open it up to questions if we're at that point.
Well, that's great. I think that's a really good beginning, and we have a lot of questions, so I can share them with you. The first is, how can we advise landlords regarding timelines for communications with agencies regarding Section 8 when they need to update or make a transition? For example, what should landlords expect in terms of turnaround time for questions they bring about paperwork?
So I don't know if this is for a new person coming or a new landlord coming on or existing, but generally in terms of communication with the housing authority, our staff, we say, you know, within 48 hours, 48 business hours to get back to somebody. You know, that's sort of our general rule. When it comes to new leasing paperwork, we understand that, you know, those can often be, we try not to sit on paperwork when it comes to, you know, moves or new units, because we know things move quickly in the market. So I think 48 business hours is sort of our standard. What I always tell people too is if you're dealing with somebody and you're one of my staff and you're not getting a response, to just loop me in right away. Sometimes people are out sick. We're in sort of we're not in a post-pandemic world quite yet. So, you know, sometimes people are out sick. We don't want you to be sitting there waiting for an answer. You can always loop in myself or one of the other supervisors, and usually we can get back to you with an answer pretty quickly, because we do understand that these things are time sensitive.
The next one is something that I'm very pleased to report that Cambridge Housing Authority has done a great job with this. And it is about the extent of Section 8 rates being aligned with market rates here in Cambridge. And the question is, to what extent is Section 8 aligned with market rate rents in Cambridge? The rents have increased and experienced volatility in the 2019-21 timeframe. Yep.
So that's a good question. So I guess going back to, I think 2018, 2019, and previously, so we have to set payment standards. So the payment standard is sort of the maximum amount that the voucher will pay according to voucher size and bedroom size. And we have to set those, housing authorities have to set those payment standards every year based off of a percentage of FMR, of fair market rent, which gets published by HUD every fall, usually late summer, early fall. So in the past, there had been one fair market rent for sort of a large metropolitan area. And we had set our payment standards based off of that one amount for the entire area. And generally, so it maybe is a little bit higher in Cambridge, but it was one amount for Cambridge, all of Cambridge, and one amount for all of Greater Boston. We didn't feel like that was really an accurate reflection of the market in Cambridge and outside of Cambridge. So in 2019, I think the end of 2019, we switched to what's called small area FMRs, where we look at each zip code, where we base our payment standards based off of the established fair market rent for each zip code. And that increased our payment standards tremendously, and has allowed us to pay much closer to what we consider to be market. I think you also asked more, or the person asked about, I lost my train of thought. The sort of volatility of the market, right? So in 2020, at least initially, we perhaps saw a bit of a softening of the market as students moved away from Cambridge and rents came down a little bit. And so when the fair market rents came out a few months ago, we actually saw a decrease in a lot of the FMRs for this area. And we didn't feel that that was accurate. And we didn't feel that it would be accurate to reduce our payment standards when the market had already swung back and was no longer softer than it had been. So what we did is, instead of reducing our payment standards, CHA, Boston Housing Authority, and the State Department of Housing submitted a challenge to HUD, and we challenged the 2021 or 2022 proposed fair market rents, and are in the process of doing a rental market study now to submit to HUD, I think by the end of the year. And we hope that as a result of that, HUD will come back with an increase in the fair market rents, which will allow us to increase our payment standards further. So it's a bit of a balance, because we have to set our payment standards within a certain range as allowed by HUD, based off these fair market rents. But we're always challenging HUD to make sure that those amounts are accurate. And we also have to be able to serve the same amount of households. So if we go up too high on our payment standards, then we can't issue as many vouchers. So it's a bit of a balancing act, but I do feel like, especially in the last few years, we've been able to get really close to what the market is asking for, based on switching to the zip code based methodology.
It really has been fantastic and been helpful to residents, I think, and owners that want to rent to some of our residents, and just haven't been able to make the numbers work until you were able to do that. And I think that's really, again, kudos to CHA for being aware of that.
We've also tried to align more with BHA, with Boston Housing Authority, and the other housing authorities in the area. I mean, there's a lot of housing authorities out there, and they're all have different boards governed by different people. But at least with BHA, we've tried to align our payment standards so that voucher holders and landlords are all sort of working with the same amounts, and there's not confusion. Well, why is CHA letting me have $2,000 and BHA is letting me have $1,500? We're trying to, where we can, align those amounts and have more coordination.
And that's actually a really great segue in terms of a question that I think the process you have described in terms of renting to a voucher holder is pretty standard across, correct me if I'm wrong, across all the different agencies, with some, again, various exceptions. But I think it's just important to point out that while probably most people who may be renting in Cambridge would have a CHA voucher, they could have a voucher from another agency or authority.
Right, and that's a good point. Because we don't put back in the day, years ago, it used to be that once a voucher holder left Cambridge, we would transfer them. If they moved to Somerville, we'd transfer them to Somerville Housing Authority. But that proved to be kind of inefficient, and from a landlord perspective as well. You're a Somerville landlord, and you have to wait for Cambridge to get the information to Somerville, to get the information to you. So now we let people move outside our jurisdictions without transferring them. And that's actually been much more efficient on the landlord side as well. But that's a good point. I mean, you could have somebody leasing a unit in Cambridge with a Somerville Housing Authority voucher. So that might be a question you want to ask up front is, who's your voucher through? Because you want to make sure if you send it to Cambridge and we're not the agency that's working with them, it might just take an extra day to get you to the right place. So that's probably a good question to ask up front. Do you know who administers your voucher? Is it Cambridge? Is it Somerville? Is it Metro Housing? Usually it's going to be Cambridge or Boston or Metro or Somerville, just because that's what most of the vouchers are in this area.
Thank you. The next two questions, the first part you did talk about a little bit, but maybe we can just reiterate about how security deposits are handled. And the second is who pays a realtor commission, which I can answer if that's helpful.
Sure. Yeah. So CHA, so we don't have funding to actually pay upfront costs upfront like that. So that's why we've come up with this sort of security deposit initiative or incentive program. So you wouldn't get paid if you wanted to collect a $500 security deposit. CHA wouldn't be able to cut you a $500 check. But we could say we would have a written agreement that would say we'd agree to pay you damages, documented damages at the conclusion of the tenancy if there was damage to the unit. Where Maura comes in is that there are some programs that do pay that up front that would be able to cut a check directly to you, the landlord, or the realtor, from the beginning. And Maura, do you want to talk about that?
Sure. As Hannah talked about, there's state programs, there's some money in the city that can assist with security deposits. Sometimes I would say that the timing can be a little off, so we might request that the owner accept a promissory note, and but that means that it's the application for that assistance has gone through the process, and just will take a while to, finish going through the process to have the check cut, but that you would actually be getting the funding. The struggle, the challenge that we have is finding resources that will pay for a realtor or broker fee on behalf of the tenant. That can be difficult. There are a couple of places that will do it. As more and more property managers have relied on brokers and realtors, we understand that is a need. And so, unfortunately, state and city funds won't pay for that. But again, there are some various nonprofit agencies and organizations that have some flexible funds where they can do that. So we do work with the tenant to do that. To access that. And sometimes tenants, if they're having their security deposit taken care of, they can, they've saved some money, so they can pay for the realtor fee while we can access funds for security deposit. So we work with CHA and with the tenants and with the owners or realtors to try to do what we can. The next question, Hannah, is CHA guarantor on the lease? And I think that's again speaks to working in concert with all of the services and resources that are here in Cambridge. We're very lucky that we have a lot, but I'll let you talk more about that.
Sure. So CHA is not a party to the lease. So it's sort of a triangular relationship, right? So there's a voucher, which is the agreement between CHA and the participant of the program. They have to follow certain rules and guidelines of the program to be a participant. The lease agreement is the agreement between the landlord and the tenant, just as you would for any non-Section 8 tenant, non-CHA tenant. And then the agreement, the third agreement, is the agreement between the housing authority and the landlord. And so that's sort of it's a contract, and it says, we're going to pay you, and these are the conditions and everything like that. So CHA has an agreement with the landlord where we will pay you, but we're not actually a signatory on the lease. So the tenant, and we're not co-signing the lease. So, we're not the tenant's power of attorney. We're not the tenant's parent. We're not a judge. So we don't have sort of legal authority over that lease when it comes to, tenant landlord law. And in a way, that's how it should be, right? Because the lease is between the tenant and the landlord, and if others are getting involved, it can be kind of sticky. But what I will say is sort of informally is that CHA really tries to work with the tenant if they have some confusion over what's in the lease. We can't give them legal advice, but we can let them know, hey, by the way, if you're violating anything in the lease, that can put your subsidy at risk, which generally people don't want that to happen. So we can sort of apply, I don't want to say pressure, but we can sort of get involved if there are issues that come up. But is CHA's name on the lease? No. So the lease is between the tenant and the landlord, and then the agreement between the landlord and CHA is what's called the Housing Assistance Payments Contract, and that outlines the parameters of the payment structure. I hope that answered the question.
The next question is, the person gets confused, and I understand why. Who certifies every year versus who certifies every 2 years?
Sure, that's a good question. So CHA has different programs, and sometimes they're governed or regulated by different parts of HUD or different parts of the federal or the state. So so certain programs recertify every year, and certain programs recertify every 2 years, and then there are some which are every 3 years. So I guess there isn't really a rule that I can, it just depends what program they're in. We do have a landlord portal that we launched, I think, very early on in COVID, that you can get if you're an existing landlord, you can get registered. And when you go in there, you can see a list of your tenants with CHA, and you can see when their next recertification date is. And that'll sort of give you an idea of what frequency they might be on. I would say for the most part, most of our households are on a 2-year cycle. But again, we are getting more, the HUD has been giving us more vouchers, and those are on an annual cycle. So right now there's more that are every 2 years, but we are starting to get more that are every year.
I have to say, these are all really great questions. I appreciate people asking these. Sorry, and I lost my place in the questions. Does the unit need to be de-lettered?
So if there are no children under 6 that are going to be occupying the unit, then CHA doesn't require any sort of de-letting certificate or compliance or anything like that. But if there are going to be children under 6, then yes, we would need to see some evidence of compliance.
And that kind of reminds me of a question that I often get asked from prospective owners. It's sort of back to the inspectional issue. I know you talked about it and you mentioned that if it passes the state sanitary code, it's likely to pass. Can you talk a little bit about some of the typical things that may be cited in an inspection, and then what happens if those are cited with the processes?
Sure. So often the things that make a unit fail are pretty minor and can be addressed pretty quickly, like a GFI not functioning or working properly, and usually that's a quick fix. If there's any sort of cracks or buckling of the ceiling or water damage or evidence of mold, things like that, you want to make sure that the there's screens in the windows and that the windows can stay open and they don't fall down. Safety things like that. If there's any sort of trip hazards in the unit. So those are probably the things I see most often, or like if the toilet's not securely bolted to the floor and it's wobbly. Generally things that are gonna, be unsafe are the things that we're probably most concerned about, and that a landlord should be concerned about as well. You don't want trip hazards or missing handrails or things like that. In terms of making the repairs, usually for a new unit that's coming on, we try to get the inspector out there within a few days very quickly, and we always prioritize new units. So if you said, I can make the repairs in a day or two, and we try to get the inspector back out there pretty quickly to clear the unit so that the move-in and the lease execution can happen. Sometimes if it's like one thing and it's very minor and you can send us a picture of it, sometimes we will accept that. If it's just like, you had to patch up some paint on the wall, and just send us a picture of it. So we've been a little bit more flexible about that during COVID, especially when, we were trying to not have, people out in units as often. So we try to work with you on that to not cause any unnecessary delays.
Great. This is taking a different tack, different type of question. The person knows that a tenant cannot be denied, an inclusionary tenant applicant cannot be denied on the basis of credit or income. Does that also apply to a voucher holder, specifically during the screening process?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So as I mentioned, CHA is both a landlord on one side and then also a Section 8 voucher administrator. So as a Section 8 voucher administrator, when we're screening somebody for eligibility for Section 8, we're not looking at their credit or their housing history. We're just screening them for income eligibility, make sure they're within the income limits of our program, and then running a CORI, criminal records check, and sex offender registry. So those are the things that we are screening for. Also to make sure that they haven't been evicted from subsidized housing in the past. There's a few other things like that, but we aren't doing, since in this capacity, we're not a landlord, we're not doing landlord related level screening. So that would be up to the landlord to decide, what are their screening processes, and do they want to do credit checks? Do they want to do housing history? We sort of leave that up to the landlord. I would say you should make sure you're treating all your tenants the same, or prospective tenants the same. You don't want to be doing credit checks only on Section 8 participants and not, you should just keep it consistent across all of your prospective tenants. Is there another part to that question? So, and then CHA as a landlord. So for our own housing, we do screening. I don't believe we do credit checks for our own housing, but I could be wrong on that. Or do you know?
I don't know. I don't think that you do.
Yeah.
And I'm going to use this as a quick plug for something that a few of us in the city are working on, which is to create an alternative credit packet that would look at a tenant's sort of rent payment history, utility payment history, landlord references, that kind of thing, so that it can maybe mitigate if someone has a credit card, outstanding credit card balance that's created a low score, but one sees that, although that might be true, all the housing related bills have been paid on time, so the credit card doesn't really impact whether they're going to be a good tenant. So we're working on that and hope to share it with folks to see if it's something people would look at.
Well, and typically too, if somebody's coming off of our waiting list and presumably they've been in sort of a situation where maybe they were paying 70% of their income towards housing, and now they have the voucher, and all of a sudden their rent's going to be affordable. So we would anticipate people coming off our waiting list perhaps don't have good credit because they've been paying 100% of their income towards their housing and have not been able to make a dent in any debts that they have. Once they're on the program, the idea is that now they have an affordable rent, so they can start working on repairing their credit. If a landlord won't rent to them, then that obviously makes it more difficult to work on those things. And CHA has a financial stability and savings program that people can opt into. That specifically, a lot of people choose to work on their credit in that program. Other people want to save towards college or home ownership in the future, or other goals that they might set for themselves. But our partner works a lot with folks on their credit.
That's wonderful. Another question: if the tenant wants to move to a property mid-month, can the voucher be tailored to the required per diem? So basically, do you have to start the lease at the beginning of the month, or can it be midterm or other dates?
Yeah, so at least CHA's policy is we don't require it to be them to move or have a lease for the first of the month. They can do it on the 7th, the 15th. You can move any day of the month, and assistance would be prorated. We just can't overlap payments. So if somebody's going to move today, we would pay the new landlord starting today through the end of December and so on. And then we would pay the prior landlord through the 6th. So sometimes, and we also make sure that tenants understand that they need to give proper notice in accordance with their prior lease. So if they're leaving another unit, they need to make sure they've given notice to that landlord. And sometimes a tenant might end up paying a little bit additional if they want to stay in that unit a few extra days, or it takes them a few days to move. So CHA can't overlap the payments, but sometimes the tenant works it out with the landlord, because the landlord wants to get in there and spend a week or two painting or turning it over. So every situation is a little different, but CHA has found that limiting moves to the first of the month actually doesn't help. That's not advantageous to landlords either. They want to fill the unit, they want to get them in, they don't want to have to wait for the first. So that's why we have been more flexible on that.
Terrific. And how are rent increases handled if an owner wants to request an increase after a year or?
Yep. So a few years ago, we actually centralized this process. So all of the rent increases go usually to one person or into one mailbox and then they get processed from there. So we have a centralized way you can submit them. It's rent increases at cambridge-housing.org. Also, if you go to our website, there's an FAQ, I think, and it includes rent increases. There's a rent increase form, shows you where to submit it. And then somebody goes in, reviews it. If it's within our payment standards, if the gross rent is within our authorized payment standards, that means that it's not going to impact the tenant portion of the rent. Usually the approval can happen pretty quickly and it gets implemented. If it does go over our payment standards, then an additional portion is going to get tacked onto the tenant's portion of the rent. So we have to get, the tenant's agreement on that. Sort of like, in a lease, if you were negotiating a new lease with a tenant and their amount's going to go up, they would need to sign that new lease. So I guess just to reiterate, if it's within our payment standards and the tenant portion isn't going to change and it's just CHA's portion that's going to go up, it's a more straightforward process. If it's going to exceed our payment standards and involves the tenant paying a little bit more of their income towards rent, then we facilitate that process of discussing that with the tenant, seeing if they will agree to it. Usually we'll reach out to you as the landlord and say, hey, by the way, you've requested a $200 rent increase for this year. We can do $175 without impacting the tenant's portion. We'll let you know what's the maximum we can go up to without impacting the tenant. And luckily, I mean, we've got a good group of landlords and they've been willing to sort of work with us and work with the tenants to make sure that the rent stays affordable for them while they're also getting what they need to, cover their expenses as a landlord. And we let you request one per year. So you couldn't request 2 rent increases in a year. It would be one every 12 months.
This is a situation, but I think it probably comes up fairly regularly. The person is a realtor and is dealing with landlords and other agents on the voucher system. They often get asked, what's the voucher price? And I've been asked this, so I totally understand. What is the voucher price? And sometimes what happens is the owner might have it listed as $1,800 as the example, but then they find out that the voucher might go up to $2,000, so they want to request the $2,000. How do you handle that?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that we also take into account tenant paid utilities. So if the payment standard's $2,000, but the tenant's responsible for heat, hot water, cooking, electric, then, and we estimate that to come out to $200 a month, then that $1,800 is really the max that we could approve. So I think sometimes that part is misunderstood. So the payment standard on our website might say $2,000, but that's only if all utilities are included in the rent. If they're not, then there's an additional amount that CHA is sort of responsible for accounting for. So we reduce that maximum amount by what we estimate the tenant paid utilities to be. So that's where sometimes some confusion comes in. I'd also say, I mean, if the landlord has posted it for $1,800, that's what we're going to assume is what they're charging for the rent. So that's what we would, and that's what they put on the leasing paperwork. That's what we would pay. And if that's what's on the lease, then that's what we would pay. So I don't know if I quite answered that question, but I'm thinking sometimes the confusion comes in where the people don't understand that the utility allowance is also factors into the equation.
And I think I asked, I took a little moderator license and asked it in a different way than it was written. I think the other part of what was written is also a fair part of the question. I think it might be a legal question, but I'm going to share it anyway, just to see if you can. It's basically, is it okay for them to say, well, I listed it at 18, but I know it'll pay 2,000. So I want that. Is that allowed? Is that really a legal question? What would you say about that?
So we also have to look, aside from our payment standards, we also have to look and make sure we have to do a rent reasonableness test. And part of that rent reasonableness test is looking at comparable units in the area. And on actually the leasing paperwork, it asks the landlord to list, if they have any other units in the building and what they're charging for them. So one of the things that we're not allowed to do is pay more for a unit just because it's Section 8. So if you have a bunch of unassisted, non-Section 8 units in your building, if you have a bunch of 1-bedrooms in your building and 5 of them don't have Section 8 and you're charging $1,800 and then you want to charge $2,500 on the Section 8, that wouldn't be approvable on our end because the comparable units are not at the same price. So that, I don't know if that might be sort of what you're asking. We have to look at the comps and make sure that you're not sort of overcharging just because this person has a subsidy. And that's sort of just responsibility of a public subsidy entity is, we shouldn't be paying more than what you're actually charging for people not receiving a subsidy. That said, I mean, I'm sure that happens. I think people do see sometimes that we pay maybe more than what they can get, and they want to take advantage of that. I mean, I don't blame people for wanting to get the maximum amount that they can, but we do have a responsibility to look at the area and make sure that there are comparable rents and comparable units in the area.
And then someone asked, can a realtor contact a landlord and a future tenant based on the listings that are on the CHA website?
Can a realtor contact
a landlord that has listed their unit on the CHA website?
Can a realtor contact a landlord?
If a realtor
like on behalf of a tenant?
I'm not sure in terms of the question. I'll read it specifically. Are there apartment listings on the CHA website? Yes. Mm-hmm. As a realtor, can I contact a landlord and a future tenant that way? So I guess there's no way to contact the future tenant, but that's not listed on the website, but the landlord.
Yeah, so the landlord, when they fill out when they post a unit, they put their contact information. So that will be posted. So if you're a realtor and you're working with a tenant, you could reach out to the landlord on behalf of for the prospective tenant. We don't post any tenant or client information on the website. So a landlord couldn't go in and try to find a tenant with us since we wouldn't post their information. But I hope that answers the question. But yeah, the landlords who post with us want to be contacted by prospective tenants. And if they're working with a realtor, then the realtor could reach out on their behalf. And sometimes it's not a realtor. Sometimes it's a caseworker or a friend or somebody else that'll reach out to the landlord too.
Mm-hmm. And a few more questions. How many Section 8 clients receive pro bono legal advice? Are there resources available to clients for helping them assess their housing contract with the landlord?
So I mentioned earlier, so we make it very clear to tenants that we can't provide legal advice. I'm not an attorney. We make sure our staff are, giving out legal advice that they're not authorized to give. So on our rent letters that we print out and give to the tenant, it does list some resources. So if you have a question about your rent share or about something on your lease, here are some agencies that you can contact. I think we list, legal services. We list some of the other mediation services in Cambridge and some other tenant organizations. So, everybody's situation is a little different. Like sometimes it might be an elder and maybe elder services is the best person to sort of get involved and not quite legal services. So the good thing is, as Maura has mentioned, there's really a lot of different types of services and agencies in the city of Cambridge, a lot of whom we work with all the time and very closely. So usually, we're able to connect them with the right agency according to what the situation is. If it's a minor issue, not always a need to get legal services involved. If it's just sort of like a housekeeping thing, there might be another agency like Elder Services that can help mitigate that without really having to go down other channels. But yeah, CHA, we're not a legal entity, so we're not giving legal advice on, things that are in the lease generally.
And the next question is a clarification. So the CHA pays the rents on the first month, and then the tenant is responsible for writing another check each month to the landlord separately, question mark?
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. So, I mean, most is the first of the month. I mean, some might say, the tenant has till the 5th of the month when their social security check comes in or something like that. But yeah, our direct deposits go out on the 1st of each month. And presumably the tenant is also writing a check for their portion around that same time. And some might have it set up to be a direct deposit as well. I think it just depends, as a landlord, how you prefer to receive your payments. I should mention though, at CHA, we do require you to be on direct deposit.
And what can cause a person to lose the voucher when they have a lease, and how long would the landlord have to remove the tenant for non-payment if that happens?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I mean, so there's sort of like there's a process of termination. So if somebody doesn't recertify, if we've been calling them in and they need to recertify in their income, and we haven't been able to reach them, technically we're supposed to terminate and go through that process. It's very rare that we would actually get all the way through to the end of terminating somebody for that, because it's we can usually eventually get them to provide what we need. It's very rare that we actually end up terminating somebody, but committing major fraud, not reporting all their income, committing very serious lease violations or having criminal activity, things like that. But that said, even when that stuff happens, CHA will send out our termination letter, and then the participant has the opportunity to appeal. So we would let the landlord know they've appealed. We will continue paying, their portion until the appeal has been, finalized and a determination has been made. So we don't just stop paying without any notice to the landlord. We would let the landlord know, hey, we've initiated a termination action effective for, February 1st. The tenant has appealed, and we will continue paying until, that has been resolved. I would say probably, 95% of the time it ends up getting resolved, and we don't end up having to terminate. Even for situations where the tenant hasn't reported all their income and there's maybe some fraud, we usually offer them the opportunity for a repayment to CHA, so they could pay back, over time, the money that was not reported. So we really try to work with tenants, because we don't want them to lose their housing over something that, maybe was a mistake or an oversight on their part. And we also don't want to disrupt payment to the landlord, especially if they've been a good tenant. That said, criminal activity and things that, are endangering other people in the building, we take very seriously, and we would proceed with termination for things like that. I would say if there's something, sometimes we do have to rely on landlords though, if of something going on in the unit, you'll probably know before we know. And so, you should let us know and we can follow up. I would say, generally good to put things in writing to the extent that you can document any issues that are going on. That's helpful, because we can't just terminate somebody without due process. We need, sort of some proof. But I'll say again, it's pretty rare that happens with our tenants. Again, partially because of we try to get all these other agencies involved to work with people before it would even get to that point.
Which is in some aspects a plug for renting to a voucher holder, because they might be involved or get connected to services quicker than a market rate person who may not be connected to any services, especially even going through CHA. So, you know, anyone, until we know we've lived with someone, winter, spring, summer, fall, as we used to say, we don't know what it's going to be like. So I think, you know, anyone, whether you have a market rate tenant or someone with a voucher, can access the services. But my point is simply that I think being connected to CHA, they might have access to those services even quicker.
Yeah. And that's why, you know, that's why I keep saying, you know, you should just treat everybody the same, right? So, you know, if somebody's not a good tenant, they're not a good tenant, whether they have a voucher or not. And you should, as a landlord, you know, do your due diligence, do your screening, you know, and, you know, look, ask a prior landlord and they'll tell you, you know, if there were any issues. And, you know, I think, you know, the going back to the credit thing, I mean, somebody's ability to pay when they didn't have, when they, you know, didn't have a subsidy, that could be something where you might be, well, okay, well now the voucher's at play, so their ability to pay is going to be much greater than it was before. When it comes to behavioral things, you know, you do your screening on that front, and whether they have a Section 8 voucher or not, you know, you should do your screening and make sure they're a good tenant.
Well, this has been really an incredible presentation. Thank you, Hannah. It's been, I think, informative. I hope our participants have felt that way. I think the questions have been really wonderful. We have 3 minutes and we have a couple of more questions that are really just sort of clarifications. Mm-hmm. So I just want to touch on those. The first is, to what extent do Section 8 clients receive information about their tenant rights, and specifically how to negotiate a rental agreement? And connected to that is that, you know, some rental agreements, you know, there's many different types. So what does CHA offer in terms of education and support? I just want to take a quick moment to make sure that everyone knows that the City of Cambridge, since a year ago, October, has a tenant rights and resources notification guide that is available and is actually required. It is required that at the inception of a tenancy and or at any notice to quit or non-renewal for any purpose other than a mutual agreement, the guide has to be given to tenants. With that said, it is mostly information about rights and resources around the termination of an agreement. And this question really speaks to the beginning, to signing that agreement. So it's something good to, you know, to think about. I don't think anything exists. Correct me if I'm wrong, Hannah, and if it doesn't, I think it's something we can certainly look into in the future.
Yeah, I was going to make a plug for that handout that you mentioned, the tenant rights and resources, I think you said is what it's called. Mm-hmm. So I think that's been a great addition. All new participants also have to go through a voucher briefing before they get their voucher, and it's a 2-hour briefing. We've been holding them bi-weekly. So it's 2 hours. It goes over all. We don't go into like specific like how to negotiate a lease, but we certainly talk about how to search for a unit, you know, how to, you know, look for a landlord, what the landlord's going to be looking for. Here's the paperwork, here's the process, and these are the rights and rules and responsibilities of the program. So it's a very substantial amount of information that we give them before we hand them that voucher and say, go look for a unit. So I think if there's ever any suggestions, I mean, HUD requires you to have certain things you go over in that briefing, but we certainly are open to if there's other things we should be including. You know, we want to make sure tenants get that information. We want to give them the best chance at success in finding a unit as possible.
Great. And the last question that I believe we have time for today that is actually been submitted is, again, a clarification about the using credit score. And the understanding was that for inclusionary housing, people cannot, prospective tenants cannot be denied because of, regardless of credit or income, but it sounds like that can happen with a voucher holder. I just want to say that inclusionary covenants are specific to the various properties. So that is a little bit of a different situation, but I'll turn it over to you for the final response on that.
I don't have too much to add. I mean, like Maura said, so CHA does not govern the inclusionary program. So we don't, you know, we don't make those rules of whether you can deny for credit or not. You would just have to make sure you follow state and federal law when it comes to how you're screening tenants. And that's why I just reemphasize that you should treat everybody the same. If you're not doing credit checks on, you know, the students that you're screening, you know, then you shouldn't be doing them on only people with a Section 8 voucher. So I think that would be my major thing to say. Not that you can't do credit checks, but just that you need to treat everybody the same. And what I said before about, you know, just if you're considering whether to consider credit checks, just keep in mind that the person might be in a very different situation now that their rent will be affordable. And so their past credit may not be reflective of their current financial situation.
So again, thank you, Hannah. Thank you to our participants. Thank you, Tracy Ukara, for providing cart services, and of course, Crystal Rosa for being the genius behind our technical abilities here. Crystal, I think you were going to put up a slide in case folks have more questions and they want to contact us. There's Hannah's email, and also for tenants, how they can apply for a voucher. And if you have any other specific questions, I'm happy to talk with you. And my number is there, 617-349-6337. Thank you so much for joining us. Please let us know if there's other topics that would be useful, and stay safe.
Thank you, Maura. And I'm going to end the webinar in a bit, but I just want to say that as soon as I'll be sending the video out to everyone who registered, and including the tenants' rights and resource guide with that email. So just look out, it'll be in the next week or so. But everyone have a good day, and thank you so much for attending. Bye.